The afternoon was cool, with a light breeze brushing against the window panes of the boutique as Samantha Rhodes stepped inside. Dressed in a tailored but modest gray suit, her presence was understated, almost unremarkable. She liked it that way anonymity allowed her to observe without interference. It was, after all, her first visit to one of the flagship stores of the company she now led as CEO. The boutique exuded an air of quiet luxury. Soft lighting highlighted displays of leather handbags, silk scarves, and rows of designer dresses hanging like artwork. The faint scent of a delicate floral perfume lingered in the air, a subtle reminder of the exclusivity the brand promised. Wealthy patrons milled about, their steps measured and deliberate, their voices low and practiced. Samantha moved slowly, scanning the layout with a trained eye, noting the strategic placement of displays and the meticulous arrangement of merchandise. But her presence did not go unnoticed. From behind the polished glass counter, a young sales associate, Linda, watched Samantha intently. She whispered to a colleague, her voice low but edged with suspicion. "Do you know her?" Linda asked, her eyes narrowing. "She doesn't look like our usual clientele." Her colleague shrugged, uninterested, but Linda couldn't let it go. There was something about Samantha. Her calm demeanor, her quiet focus, that unsettled her. She didn't fit the mold of the affluent regulars who breezed in and out, their privilege apparent in every gesture. Linda's unease took root and grew, her imagination filling the gaps where understanding should have been. Unaware of the scrutiny, Samantha lingered by a display of handbags. She picked up a sleek leather clutch, running her fingers over the smooth material. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, learning every aspect of the retail industry. She knew the quality when she saw it. But her moment of appreciation was interrupted. "Excuse me, ma'am," came a voice from behind. Samantha turned to see a burly man in a security uniform standing a few feet away. His presence was imposing, his expression severe. "Can I help you with something?" The words seemed polite enough, but the tone carried a different weight. One of doubt, of caution. Samantha held the clutch lightly in her hand and smiled. "No, thank you," she replied. "I'm just browsing." The man, George, did not move. His eyes lingered on her longer than they should have, as if searching for evidence to confirm a suspicion he couldn't quite articulate. Samantha felt the shift in the air, the unspoken tension that had followed her in spaces like this her entire life. "We've had some incidents recently," George said, his voice now more direct. "Just making sure everything is in order." Samantha raised an eyebrow, her grip on the clutch steady. "I see," she said evenly. "And what incidents might those be?" George hesitated, glancing toward Linda, who stood watching from a distance. Her arms crossed. "Just a precaution," he muttered, his gaze hardening. "I'm going to need to check your bag, ma'am." The words landed heavily, drawing the attention of nearby customers. A middle-aged woman in pearls paused mid-conversation, her eyes flicking toward Samantha with barely concealed judgment. A man in an expensive suit whispered to his companion, his expression one of bemused curiosity. The quiet murmur of the boutique gave way to an undercurrent of whispers. Samantha's expression didn't waver, but inside, a familiar anger began to simmer. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "It's just procedure," George said, though there was no real conviction in his tone. "We have to be cautious." Samantha set the clutch down gently, her movements deliberate. She straightened, meeting George's gaze. "If you have reason to suspect me of a crime," she said, her voice steady, "then call the police. Otherwise, I suggest you let me continue my shopping in peace." The murmurs around them grew louder. Linda stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Look, we don't want any trouble," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We just need to make sure everything is in order." Samantha's jaw tightened. She had faced moments like this before, moments where her qualifications, her accomplishments, her very presence were called into question simply because of the color of her skin. It didn't matter that she was the CEO of this very company. Here, she was just another unwelcome intruder. "Call the police," she said again, her voice sharper now. "I'll wait." George hesitated but then spoke into his radio. "We have a situation," he said, Need backup. The minutes that followed felt suspended in time. The soft music continued to play, incongruous against the rising tension in the room. Customers shifted uncomfortably, some pulling out their phones to record, sensing that this moment was bigger than the boutique's polished walls. 2 police officers arrived quickly, their presence adding to the weight of the moment. Samantha stood tall, her posture unyielding as they approached. One of them, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, addressed her curtly. "We've been called here for a report of suspicious behavior. We need you to step aside and answer some questions." Samantha's eyes met his, unwavering. "On what basis?" she asked. "What exactly am I being accused of?" The officer's gaze flicked to George, then back to Samantha. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. And I am just doing mine," she replied. "But if you insist on detaining me, I'd like to make a call." The officers exchanged a glance but nodded. Samantha retrieved her phone with calm precision and dialed a number. "It's Samantha," she said after a moment. "I need you here now." When her lawyer, Robert, arrived 20 minutes later, the mood in the boutique had shifted. The staff looked nervous, the officers defensive, and the customers uneasy. Robert entered with authority, his sharp suit and steady voice commanding attention. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone icy. "Do you have any idea who this woman is?" The silence that followed was deafening. Samantha let the revelation hang in the air before speaking. "I'm Samantha Rhodes," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "CEO of this company. And what you've just done is more than an insult to me. It's a reflection of everything we need to change." Her words echoed in the boutique, leaving everyone frozen in place. Samantha looked around, taking in the stunned faces, the shame, and the discomfort. "This ends here," she said, her tone unyielding. "For me, and for anyone else who has ever been made to feel unwelcome in this space." And with that, she walked toward the exit, leaving behind a room filled with silence and the weight of an undeniable truth. The morning after the incident, Samantha Rhodes sat in her office, the city skyline stretching endlessly behind her. The events at the boutique replayed in her mind, not with anger, but with a measured clarity. She had always known this was part of her reality, but experiencing it so vividly on her own terms, inside her own company, carried a sting she hadn't anticipated. Her assistant, Grace, entered the room quietly, carrying a steaming cup of tea and a stack of printed emails. "These started coming in last night," Grace said softly, placing the papers on Samantha's desk. "Most of them are statements from employees who were at the store. A few are from customers." Samantha nodded, reaching for the top paper. She read each word carefully, her expression giving nothing away. One email stood out, a letter from a middle-aged woman who had been shopping during the incident. "I was there yesterday, standing just a few feet away from you. I regret to say that my first thought when I saw you was, what is she doing here? But as the situation unfolded, I realized how wrong I was. How wrong we all were. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. I just stood there, silent. I'm sorry." Samantha put the paper down, her fingers resting lightly on its edge. She didn't need to reread it to know that it captured a truth so many others were unwilling to admit. The weight of it sat heavily in the quiet of her office. Grace hesitated. "There's also a call scheduled with Marcus Davenport, the regional manager, in an hour. He's asked for guidance on damage control." "Damage control," Samantha repeated, the words tasting bitter. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the view outside. "That's what this is to them, a PR crisis. Not reckoning." Grace didn't respond. She knew better than to interrupt Samantha when her thoughts ran deep. After a long moment, Samantha sighed. "Let's prepare for the call." The video conference began promptly at noon, Marcus's face appearing on the screen, pale and strained. "Miss Rhodes," he began, his voice tight with nervous energy. "First, let me say how deeply sorry I am for what happened yesterday. This is not reflective of our company's values." Samantha studied him for a moment before responding, her tone even. "It happened in one of our stores, under your oversight. So, tell me, Marcus, what exactly are our values?" He faltered, his carefully rehearsed apology crumbling. Well, We pride ourselves on customer service and creating a welcoming environment. But we failed. Samantha finished for him, her voice steady. And not just yesterday. This is not a single incident. Marcus. It's a symptom of a deeper problem. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I've already started looking into the policies at that store. We're reviewing the security footage. Speaking to staff. Good. Samantha interrupted, leaning forward slightly. And once that's done, I expect a detailed report outlining not just what happened, but why it happened. Of course, he replied quickly, relieved to have a concrete task. I'll make sure it's thorough. I'm not interested in thoroughness, Samantha said, her tone sharpening. I'm interested in honesty. Don't sanitize this for the sake of appearances. The people watching yesterday's events unfold didn't see a misunderstanding. They saw what they've seen time and time again. Bias in action. Marcus nodded, but Samantha could see the hesitation in his eyes. She didn't expect him to fully grasp the weight of her words. Not yet. Change, she knew, was rarely swift, especially in an organization that had been built on unexamined privilege. That evening, Samantha sat in her apartment, the city lights twinkling outside the window. A glass of water rested untouched on the table beside her as she reviewed more emails and internal reports. The silence around her was profound, broken only by the occasional hum of traffic far below. Her phone buzzed. A message from Robert, her lawyer. We've received inquiries from a few media outlets about the incident. They're asking if you plan to make a public statement. Let me know how you want to proceed. Samantha stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. Not yet. This isn't about public perception. It's about internal accountability. We focus on fixing the root before we address the branches. She set the phone down and leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. Accountability. It was a word she had repeated to herself so many times over the years, often as a mantra to keep her steady in the face of adversity. Yet here, in her own company, it felt elusive, tangled in layers of bureaucracy and quiet resistance. Her thoughts drifted to the faces from the day before. George's defensive posture, Linda's sharp gaze, the officers who had come into the boutique with assumptions already written on their faces. And then the customers. Their silence had been the loudest of all. It was a quiet kind of violence, Samantha thought, not the physical kind, but the insidious kind that seeps into everyday life. Unacknowledged and unchecked. It was the glance that lingered too long, the doubt that lingered unspoken, the silence that weighed heavier than any accusation. She opened her eyes, her resolve hardening. This was the moment that mattered. Not the headlines, not the public outcry, but the quiet, methodical work of dismantling the structures that allowed this to happen in the first place. The work would be slow and unglamorous, but it was the only path forward. Samantha picked up her pen and began writing. Her next meeting wasn't until morning. But the work couldn't wait. It never could. The corporate office buzzed with subdued energy, the kind that suggested everyone was working a little harder than usual to appear occupied. Samantha Rhodes walked briskly down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Heads turned as she passed. But no one spoke. The air carried a heavy weight of unspoken tension, like the eye of a storm before the winds returned. She entered the conference room where her task force was already assembled. Papers were strewn across the long table, along with open laptops glowing with half-written reports. Robert, her lawyer, stood by the window, his arms crossed, staring out at the city below. "Good morning," Samantha said as she took her seat at the head of the table. Her voice was calm, but it carried an edge that silenced the murmured conversations. The team murmured their greetings, and Grace slid a stack of documents in front of her. "These are the initial findings from the audits," Grace said, her voice low. "We've identified patterns." Samantha nodded and began flipping through the papers. The findings were as damning as she had expected. Repeated complaints of racial profiling across multiple stores, disparities in how employees of different backgrounds were treated, and training practices that barely skimmed the surface of meaningful inclusion. As she scanned the reports, Robert spoke up. "We're also seeing resistance," he said. "Some managers are dragging their feet on implementing the new policies. Others are outright refusing." Samantha glanced up, her expression unreadable. Specific names? Robert handed her another folder. Greg Turner, regional manager for the Southeastern Division, is the most vocal. He's claiming the policies are disruptive to store operations and unnecessary. Samantha opened the folder and scanned Greg's file. His employment history was pristine on paper, but she could see the gaps. The subtle red flags that didn't appear in performance reviews but spoke volumes in the complaints filed by employees under his leadership. Greg Turner, she said, her voice measured. Let's start with him. The video call with Greg Turner was scheduled for later that afternoon. Samantha sat at her desk, the sun streaming through the windows behind her. As Greg's face appeared on the screen, his expression was carefully neutral, but there was a tightness around his mouth that betrayed his frustration. Miss Rhodes, he began, his voice polite but strained. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. Of course, Greg, Samantha replied evenly. I understand you have concerns about the new policies. Greg shifted in his seat. Yes, I do. With all due respect, I think we're overcorrecting here. We've had some isolated incidents. Sure, but this is a good company with good people. These measures are making it harder for us to do our jobs. Samantha studied him for a moment before responding. Greg, do you know how many complaints of racial profiling were filed across your stores in the last 3 years? He hesitated, clearly caught off guard. I don't have the exact number. 47, Samantha said. 47 complaints. Greg, that's not an isolated issue. That's a pattern. Greg's expression hardened. With all due respect, Miss Rhodes, not all of those complaints were valid. People misunderstand intentions, or they exaggerate. And how many of those complaints were thoroughly investigated? Samantha asked, her voice calm but firm. Greg didn't answer. That's what I thought, Samantha said. Greg, this isn't about overcorrection. This is about accountability. And if you can't see that, then perhaps you're not the right person to lead your division. Greg's jaw tightened. I've been with this company for 20 years. He said, I've seen it grow, and I've contributed to its success. I don't think it's fair to question my loyalty or my judgment based on one issue. This isn't about loyalty, Greg, Samantha replied. It's about leadership. If you're unwilling to lead by example, then yes, I'm questioning whether you're fit for this role. The silence that followed was heavy. Samantha could see the anger in Greg's eyes. But he didn't argue further. I'll comply with the policies, he said finally, his voice clipped. If that's what you're asking. It's not a request, Samantha said simply. Thank you for your time, Greg. After the call ended, Samantha sat back in her chair, her hands resting on the armrests. She felt the familiar weight of exhaustion creeping in, but she pushed it aside. This was just the beginning. That evening, as she reviewed more reports in the quiet of her apartment, her phone buzzed with a message from Grace. Internal chatter suggests some managers are trying to organize resistance. They're claiming the new policies are a threat to their authority. Samantha stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Let them talk. We'll keep documenting everything. She put the phone down and leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. The resistance was not surprising. It was human nature to push back against change, especially when it challenged deeply ingrained beliefs and power structures. But it was also a reminder of how far they had to go. She thought of the woman who had apologized in her email, admitting her silent complicity. That was the first step. Samantha knew, breaking the silence, naming the problem. But the work didn't end there. It couldn't. Outside, the city lights sparkled against the night sky, and Samantha sat in the stillness, preparing for the battles yet to come. The day began quietly, as most days did in the corporate headquarters. Samantha Rhodes arrived earlier than usual, her coffee in hand and her briefcase heavy with documents from the latest round of audits. The stillness of the office in those early hours gave her space to think. Though she knew it was a fragile peace, the storm, she could feel, was far from over. At her desk, she opened the latest email from Grace, detailing a troubling trend. Some employees in certain stores had reported feeling pressured to stay silent about discriminatory practices. While the overt resistance of managers like Greg Turner had made headlines within the company, it was this quieter, insidious form of defiance that worried Samantha more. Silence, after all, could be just as damaging as open hostility. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the email, her thoughts turning to the upcoming regional manager meeting. Today's agenda was clear: address the findings of the audits and set expectations moving forward. But Samantha knew that behind the professional veneer, resistance would linger. Change was rarely comfortable, especially when it required people to confront their own biases. The conference room filled slowly, the regional managers taking their seats around the large table. Samantha watched them as they settled in, each carrying their own version of nervous energy. Some shuffled papers unnecessarily, others glanced around, trying to gauge the room. Greg Turner was there, his face impassive, but Samantha could see the tension in his posture. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm yet firm. The hum of side conversations quieted instantly. "Thank you all for being here. Today, we'll be discussing the initial results of our company-wide audit and the steps we need to take moving forward." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "The findings, as many of you are aware, confirm what we've long suspected. Racial bias is not an isolated issue within this company. It is systemic, and it has gone unaddressed for far too long." A faint rustle of discomfort swept through the room. Samantha continued, unflinching, "Our goal is not to point fingers or assign blame but to identify the root causes of these issues and address them. This will require cooperation from everyone in this room. Resistance, intentional or otherwise, will not be tolerated." Greg cleared his throat. "If I may, Miss Rhodes," he said, his voice measured but tinged with defensiveness. "Some of us feel that the narrative here has been exaggerated. Yes, there have been incidents, but we're a company of thousands. Isn't it possible that we're focusing too much on the negative?" Samantha met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Greg, when you say focusing too much on the negative, do you mean addressing the harm caused to our employees and customers? Because that is not a narrative. It is a reality." Greg's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Samantha turned her attention back to the group. "This isn't about attacking anyone. It's about accountability. Every one of us here has a responsibility to ensure that our stores are places where all people feel valued and respected. If we fail in that responsibility, we fail as leaders." The discussion that followed was tense but productive. Some managers, like Sarah Jenkins, voiced their support for the new policies, sharing how they had already begun implementing changes in their regions. Others, like Greg, remained skeptical, though they refrained from outright opposition. Samantha took note of the dynamics, cataloging allies and detractors alike. After the meeting, Samantha lingered in the conference room, reviewing her notes. Robert entered, his expression unreadable as he closed the door behind him. "Well?" she asked. "It's a mixed bag," he said, sitting across from her. "You've got some who are on board, but others are still dragging their feet. Greg is a problem, but you already know that." Samantha nodded. "He's not the only one. There are others who won't say it outright, but they're just as resistant. We need to find a way to reach them." Robert leaned back, folding his arms. "You can't change everyone, Samantha. Some people won't budge, no matter what you do." "I know," she said quietly, "but if we don't try, nothing will change." Later that afternoon, Samantha visited one of the flagship stores as part of her ongoing assessments. The store manager, a young woman named Maya, greeted her warmly, though Samantha could sense the undercurrent of nerves. "We've been working on implementing the new training programs," Maya said as they walked the store floor. "It's been challenging. Some of the staff are resistant, but others have really embraced it." Samantha nodded, her eyes scanning the store. "Change is always challenging," she said, "but it's necessary. Have you noticed any shifts in the way customers are treated?" Maya hesitated. "Yes and no. Most of the staff are making an effort, but there are still moments. Little things. A customer being followed too closely, or a tone that's just different." Samantha stopped and turned to Maya. "And when those moments happen, how do you address them?" "I try to have private conversations," Maya said. "I explain why it's wrong, and I encourage them to reflect on their actions. But some people are defensive. They don't see it as biased. They think they're just doing their job." Samantha sighed softly. That's the challenge, isn't it? Bias doesn't always announce itself. It hides in the assumptions we make, the judgments we pass without even realizing it. Maya nodded, her expression thoughtful. Do you think we'll ever really change it? I think we have to try, Samantha said. And that starts with conversations like this. Naming the problem is the first step. As Samantha left the store that evening, she reflected on the day's events. The resistance was there, unmistakable, but so were the seeds of change. She thought of Maya, of Sarah Jenkins, of the employees who were beginning to challenge their own assumptions. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but it was a start. The city lights blurred through the car window as Samantha made her way home. She was tired, but there was a quiet resolve in her heart. The road ahead was long, but she had never been one to turn back. Change was coming, slowly, painfully, but inevitably, and she would see it through, one step at a time. The office felt heavier that day. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken tension, a subtle charge that seemed to linger in the spaces between conversations. Samantha Rhodes noticed it as soon as she arrived, her presence drawing quick glances from staff and a sudden silence in nearby cubicles. She was used to being watched. Her position ensured that. But today felt different. There was something brewing, something quieter but no less powerful than the overt resistance she had faced in meetings. She settled into her office, her usual routine interrupted by the persistent buzz of her phone. The messages poured in, concerns from employees, reports from the task force, and a growing stream of updates on the implementation of the new training programs. Most were factual, straightforward, but a few carried undertones of frustration or outright defiance. Morning, Robert said as he stepped into her office, a thick file in hand. His expression was serious, his usual calm tinged with unease. You've got to see this. Samantha gestured for him to sit, and he placed the file on her desk. Inside were pages of notes, emails, and transcriptions. Robert didn't need to explain, the pattern was clear. A handful of regional managers and store supervisors had begun coordinating subtle acts of defiance, missing mandatory meetings, quietly undermining the new initiatives, and fostering a culture of passive resistance among their teams. This is organized, Robert said. It's not loud, but it's deliberate. They're trying to slow us down, maybe hoping we'll lose steam. Samantha skimmed through the reports, her jaw tightening. It's exactly what I feared, she said. Open resistance is one thing. This is harder to root out. Robert nodded. The question is, how do we respond without making it worse? If we push too hard, we risk alienating the ones who are on the fence. That afternoon, Samantha convened a small meeting with key members of the task force. The group gathered in a quiet conference room, the mood tense but determined. Among them was Rachel, the legal advisor who had been instrumental in shaping the company's response, and David, a senior HR representative with years of experience navigating workplace conflict. We need to address this quickly and carefully, Samantha began, her tone calm but firm. The resistance isn't just coming from individuals, it's systemic. It's embedded in the culture. And if we're not careful, it will undermine everything we're trying to do. Rachel leaned forward, her brow furrowed. The problem is that this kind of resistance is harder to document. They're not outright refusing, they're just delaying, missing meetings, dragging their feet on implementation. It's enough to cause disruption, but not enough to take immediate action against them. David nodded in agreement. We need to focus on the middle ground, he said, the ones who are hesitant but not outright resistant. If we can get them on board, it might isolate the more defiant managers and make it harder for them to gain traction. Samantha considered this, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. Then we need to shift the narrative, she said. Make it clear that this isn't about punishment, it's about building something better. We need to find a way to show them what's possible when they embrace these changes. Later that week, Samantha visited one of the stores identified as a hub of quiet resistance. The store was in an affluent suburb. Its sleek exterior and high-end displays a stark contrast to the unease she felt as she walked through its doors. The manager, a man named Chris, greeted her with a strained smile. His tone was polite, but Samantha could sense the underlying tension. "Thank you for visiting, Miss Rhodes," Chris said, leading her through the store. "We've been working on the new training programs. As you requested." Samantha nodded, her eyes scanning the floor. The staff seemed professional, attentive, but there was a stiffness to their interactions, a formality that lacked warmth. She watched as a black customer browsed a rack of dresses. Her movements followed discreetly by a sales associate. The associate's behavior wasn't overtly hostile, but there was a subtle distance in her demeanor, a hesitation that spoke volumes. "Chris," Samantha said as they paused near the back of the store, "how has your team been responding to the training?" Chris hesitated, his smile faltering. "It's been an adjustment," he admitted. "Some of them are struggling to see the relevance. They don't think it applies to them." Samantha met his gaze, her expression steady. "And what do you think?" Chris shifted uncomfortably. "I think it's a lot of change all at once. People are on edge, worried about making mistakes. Change is never easy," Samantha said, her tone even. "But it's necessary, and it starts with leadership. Your team will follow your example. If you embrace this, they will too. If you don't, they'll resist." Chris didn't respond immediately, his expression thoughtful. Samantha could see the conflict in his eyes. The pull between old habits and the challenge of growth. Back at headquarters, Samantha reflected on the day's visit. Chris's hesitation mirrored what she had seen in others, a fear of stepping into the unknown, of letting go of long-held beliefs. She understood that fear, but she also knew it couldn't be allowed to dictate the company's future. She drafted a memo that evening, addressing the entire organization. Her words were measured, deliberate, a call to action that balanced accountability with hope. "This is not about blaming or shaming anyone," she wrote. "It is about recognizing the biases we all carry and making a conscious effort to do better. Change is difficult, but it is also an opportunity, a chance to create a company that reflects the values we claim to uphold. I believe in this company. And I believe in all of you. Together, we can build something extraordinary." The next morning, Samantha's inbox was flooded with responses. Some were supportive, expressing gratitude for her leadership. Others were more guarded, voicing concerns but also a willingness to engage. And then there were the anonymous emails. The ones that dripped with resentment, accusing her of pushing an agenda, of dividing the company. She read them all, her resolve hardening with each word. The resistance was real, but so was the potential for change. She had seen it in the store managers who were beginning to shift their perspectives, in the employees who were finding their voices, and in the quiet but growing momentum of those who believed in her vision. The work was far from over, but Samantha was ready. Change, she knew, was rarely loud. It started in the quiet moments. In the decisions people made when no one was watching, in the conversations that planted seeds of understanding. It was slow, often painful, but it was happening, and she would see it through, one step at a time. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the boardroom, casting long shadows across the polished oak table. Samantha Rhodes sat at its head, her fingers resting lightly on a stack of reports. Around her, the air was heavy with expectation. The regional managers had gathered, their expressions guarded, a mixture of unease and defiance etched into their faces. It was clear that this meeting would not be easy. Samantha began with a measured calm, her voice steady and deliberate. "Thank you all for coming. I called this meeting because it's time for us to address the challenges we've been facing. Over the past few weeks, we've seen incredible progress in some areas, but we've also encountered resistance that threatens to undermine everything we're trying to achieve." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. Some of the managers looked away, their discomfort palpable. Others met her gaze with thinly veiled defiance. One of them, Greg Turner, a regional manager who had been vocal in his opposition to the new policies, leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Miss Rhodes," Greg began, his tone laced with condescension, "we've all heard your speeches about change and inclusion, but some of us feel that these changes are being forced on us without considering the realities on the ground. Our stores are already struggling to meet targets. Adding more training, more policies, it's too much. It's bad for business." Samantha regarded him calmly. "Greg, I understand your concerns, she replied. But let me ask you this. How can we claim to serve a diverse clientele if our practices alienate and discriminate against the very people we're supposed to welcome? How can we succeed as a company if we ignore the values that our customers demand from us? Greg's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Samantha let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. I've read the reports, she said, holding up a thick folder. I've seen the patterns: customers being profiled, employees being silenced, managers turning a blind eye to behavior that's unacceptable. This isn't just a moral failure. It's a failure of leadership. The room was still, save for the faint rustle of papers as some of the managers shifted uncomfortably. Samantha could feel the weight of their resistance, the pull of years of entrenched habits and unexamined biases. But she also knew that beneath the surface, there was a chance for change, a chance to reshape the culture of the company. After the meeting, Samantha walked back to her office, her thoughts heavy but focused. She had pushed back against resistance before, but this felt different. The resistance wasn't just about policies. It was about identity. About the fear of losing control in a world that was changing faster than some could accept. Her assistant, Carla, met her at the door, holding a printout of an email. You should see this, Carla said, her tone cautious. Samantha took the paper and read the message. It was from an anonymous employee at one of the stores where resistance had been strongest. Thank you for standing up for us. The email read, I've worked here for years, and I've seen so many things that I knew were wrong but didn't feel I could speak up about. For the first time, I feel like someone is listening. Please don't stop fighting for this. Some of us believe in what you're doing. Samantha set the paper down, a faint smile touching her lips. It was a small thing, but it was enough to remind her why she had taken on this fight. For every voice raised in opposition, there were others who were finding the courage to speak out, voices that had been silenced for too long. The following week, Samantha visited another store, this time in a suburban neighborhood where the community was as diverse as the customers who walked through its doors. The store manager, a woman named Rachel, had embraced the new training programs wholeheartedly. As Samantha walked through the aisles, she could see the difference. The staff were engaged, attentive without being intrusive, their interactions with customers marked by a warmth that felt genuine. It wasn't easy at first, Rachel admitted as they sat in her office later. Some of the team resisted the training. They thought it was just corporate fluff, something we had to check off a list. But as we started having real conversations about bias, about the experiences of our colleagues and customers, things began to change. Samantha nodded, listening intently. And how do you feel now? She asked. Rachel smiled. Proud, she said simply. Proud of my team. Proud of the work we're doing. I didn't realize how much we had to learn until we started listening. But not all visits were so encouraging. At another store, Samantha encountered a manager who had done little to implement the new policies. The staff seemed disengaged, their interactions perfunctory at best. When Samantha asked the manager, a man named Paul, about the training, his response was dismissive. We've been busy, Paul said with a shrug. I haven't had time to prioritize it. Samantha's expression didn't waver. Paul, this isn't optional, she said, her voice firm. If you're too busy to prioritize the values of this company, then maybe this isn't the right role for you. Paul's face reddened, but he didn't argue. Samantha left the store with a heavy heart, knowing that there were still battles to be fought, still minds to be changed. That evening, as Samantha sat in her office reviewing the day's reports, she received a call from Robert. I've been going through the latest feedback, he said. It's a mixed bag, but there's a definite shift. More employees are speaking up, and some of the managers who were resistant are starting to come around. That's good to hear, Samantha said, though her tone was thoughtful. But it's not enough. We need to keep pushing. Keep showing them why this matters. Robert paused, then said, You know, you've done more than most people in your position would. You've faced resistance at every turn. And you've kept going. That's not nothing, Samantha. She smiled faintly, grateful for his words. Thanks, Robert. But this isn't about me. It's about making sure no one else has to fight this hard just to be treated with basic respect. As she ended the call, Samantha leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the city lights outside her window. The fight was far from over, but she felt a quiet resolve settling in her chest. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. And she would see it through, no matter how long it took. The days were growing shorter, the cool air hinting at the approach of winter. Samantha Rhodes watched the city skyline from her office, the late afternoon light casting a golden hue over the buildings. There was a calm to the view that contrasted with the undercurrents of tension she knew were rippling through the company. Change was happening, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. Samantha turned back to her desk, where a neatly organized stack of reports awaited her review. The task force's audits had reached their halfway point, uncovering a mix of encouraging progress and stubborn resistance. The data painted a complex picture, one that revealed the layered and often unspoken challenges of addressing systemic discrimination. Yet, among the numbers and summaries, Samantha could see the beginnings of a shift. Carla, her assistant, appeared in the doorway with a hesitant knock. "Miss Rhodes," she said, holding a letter in her hand. "This just arrived for you. I thought you might want to read it right away." Samantha gestured for her to come in. She took the envelope, noting the elegant handwriting on the front. It was from an employee at a store she had visited early in the process, a store where the resistance had been especially strong. As she unfolded the letter, her eyes skimmed over the words. It was a quiet acknowledgement of change, written by a sales associate who had initially felt alienated by the company's new direction. The letter described how the training sessions, once dismissed as irrelevant, had opened conversations that staff had never dared to have before. It spoke of a newfound understanding among coworkers, of customers expressing gratitude for being treated with dignity. Samantha set the letter down, a faint smile crossing her face. These moments were rare but powerful, a reminder that the work she was doing mattered, even when the resistance felt insurmountable. That evening, Samantha attended a company-hosted event celebrating the completion of a major milestone in their diversity training rollout. It was held in a modest but elegant venue, the kind of setting that encouraged quiet conversation rather than grand speeches. As she entered, Samantha noticed familiar faces among the crowd, managers who had supported her efforts from the beginning, employees who had shared their stories, even a few board members who had been initially skeptical but were now cautiously optimistic. The keynote speaker was Rachel, the manager from the suburban store who had embraced the changes wholeheartedly. As she stepped up to the podium, the room quieted. When these policies were first announced, Rachel began, her voice steady. "I'll admit, I was skeptical, not because I didn't believe in the values behind them, but because I didn't know if we could truly change. It's hard to look at the culture of your workplace and see its flaws, especially when you've been a part of it for so long." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "But then we started listening. To each other, to our customers, to the stories we'd ignored or dismissed. And what I learned was that change isn't about grand gestures or instant solutions. It's about the small, deliberate steps we take every day to be better." The audience applauded, their expressions thoughtful. Samantha watched from the back, her heart swelling with quiet pride. This was the kind of leadership she had hoped to inspire. Not through mandates or ultimatums, but through example. The next morning, Samantha was back in the office, reviewing the latest reports from the task force. One caught her attention, a summary of incidents from a store where resistance had been particularly vocal. The report detailed how a handful of employees, initially hostile to the training, had started to participate more actively in the sessions. Their questions had shifted from confrontational to curious, their behavior from defensive to reflective. Samantha called the store manager, a man named James, who had been on the fence about the policies when they were first introduced. "James," she said after exchanging pleasantries, "I was reading the latest update from your store, and I wanted to hear your perspective. How are things going?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Samantha could hear James take a deep breath. "It's been unexpected," he admitted. "At first, I thought this was just going to cause more division. But something's changed. People are talking to each other in ways they never did before. It's not perfect, but it feels different. Better." Samantha nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "That's good to hear, James." Change is never easy, but it sounds like your team is starting to embrace it. They are, he said, his voice thoughtful. And so am I. Later that week, Samantha visited a different store, one where progress had been slower. The manager, Greg Turner, greeted her with a stiff handshake. His expression guarded. It was clear he was still resistant, though his tone had softened since their last conversation. "Thank you for coming," Greg said as they walked the aisles together. "Things are fine." "Fine," Samantha repeated, her voice neutral. She stopped to examine a display, giving herself a moment to gather her thoughts. "Greg, let me ask you something. When you hear your employees talk about these changes, what do they say?" Greg hesitated, his gaze darting away. "Some of them don't like it. They think it's unnecessary. And the others?" Samantha prompted gently. He sighed. "Some of them think it's overdue. That it's about time we started paying attention to things like this." Samantha nodded, sensing the conflict in his words. Change is always going to be uncomfortable, especially when it forces us to confront things we'd rather ignore. But that discomfort is where growth happens. Greg didn't reply immediately, but Samantha could see the wheels turning in his mind. As they continued their walk, she made a mental note to follow up with him, knowing that some changes took time. As the month drew to a close, Samantha gathered her team for a review of their progress. The conference room was filled with charts, spreadsheets, and notes from the task force. Carla presented the latest data, her voice steady as she outlined the findings. "We've seen measurable improvement in customer satisfaction scores at the stores that have completed the training," Carla said. "Employee feedback is also trending more positively, though there are still pockets of resistance." Samantha leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "And what about the managers who've been most resistant? Have there been any breakthroughs?" Robert, her legal advisor, nodded. "A few. Some of them are starting to come around, though it's clear they're still struggling with the pace of change. Others, well, they're going to need more direct intervention." Samantha sighed, her expression thoughtful. "Then that's where we'll focus next. We can't expect perfection overnight, but we also can't let the resistance undermine what we've accomplished." The team nodded, their determination evident. Samantha felt a renewed sense of purpose as she looked around the room. The work was far from over, but the tide was beginning to turn. As she left the office that evening, Samantha reflected on the journey so far. The progress they had made wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a quiet hope that the company could become what she had always believed it could be: a place where everyone, regardless of who they were, felt they belonged. The final days of the year brought a sense of closure to Samantha Rhodes' journey. Though she knew the work was far from complete, the company's transformation was underway. A fragile but undeniable shift toward accountability and inclusivity. The task force had finished its audits, and the data painted a sobering picture. Discrimination had been a systemic issue, embedded not only in individual biases but also in the structures and practices of the organization. Yet amidst the challenges, there were signs of hope. Samantha stood by her office window, watching the soft flurry of snow coat the city streets. The world outside seemed calm, but her thoughts were restless. Today, she would present the final findings and recommendations to the board, a culmination of months of work, resistance, and hard-won progress. Carla entered the room, carrying a thick folder. "Here's the finalized report," she said, setting it on Samantha's desk. "It's all their employee testimonials, audit findings, and the proposed next steps." Samantha flipped through the pages, her expression steady. The document represented not just statistics and policies but the voices of employees who had shared their stories, some for the first time. Each page felt like a reminder of why she had started this fight. To challenge the quiet injustice that had been allowed to persist for too long. "Thank you, Carla," Samantha said, offering a small smile. "Let's make sure the board sees every word of this." The boardroom was silent as Samantha began her presentation. The room was filled with the familiar faces of board members, some skeptical, others supportive. William Hartley, the CEO, sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. "Over the past several months, we've conducted a comprehensive review of our company's culture and practices," Samantha began, her tone calm but firm. What we've found is a systemic pattern of bias and exclusion that has not only harmed our employees and customers but also undermined our values as a company. She clicked a button on the remote, and the screen behind her displayed a chart. These are the results of our audits. At over 60% of our locations, there were documented incidents of racial profiling or discriminatory behavior. In many cases, these incidents were either ignored or actively dismissed by management. A murmur spread through the room. But Samantha continued, her voice steady. This is not just about individual actions. It's about a culture that allowed these behaviors to persist unchecked. And if we are serious about being a company that values integrity, we must address this head on. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The task force has identified 3 key areas for immediate action: continued diversity training, a restructuring of our hiring and promotion practices, and the implementation of a clear accountability system for addressing discrimination. Elena Martinez, one of the more supportive board members, nodded. This is necessary, she said, her voice thoughtful. But it won't be easy. It won't, Samantha agreed. Change never is. But we've seen progress. Employees are beginning to trust that their voices matter. Customers are noticing the difference. This is the direction we need to go. Richard Cole, who had been one of the more resistant voices, leaned forward. And what about the managers who are still pushing back? Are we just going to force them out? Samantha met his gaze without flinching. Some will adapt, and others won't. But we can't allow their resistance to dictate the future of this company. If they can't align with our values, then yes, they will need to leave. The room fell silent again, the weight of the conversation palpable. Finally, William Hartley spoke. Samantha, he said, his voice measured, you've made a compelling case. I think it's clear to everyone in this room that we can't afford to ignore this any longer. I support your recommendations. One by one, the board members voiced their agreement, some more reluctantly than others. When the vote was taken, Samantha's plan was approved unanimously. In the weeks that followed, the company began to implement the recommendations. The changes were met with mixed reactions. Some employees embraced the new direction wholeheartedly, while others continued to resist. But Samantha remained steadfast, her quiet determination setting the tone for the entire organization. She spent her days visiting stores, speaking with employees, and listening to their stories. At one store, a young sales associate approached her after a meeting. Miss Rhodes, the woman said, her voice hesitant, I just wanted to say thank you. A year ago, I wouldn't have felt safe speaking up about some of the things I've experienced here. But now, it feels different. Samantha nodded, her expression softening. That means a lot to me, she said, but it's only the beginning. We still have work to do. As the year came to a close, the company hosted a small gathering to celebrate its progress. The event was understated, reflecting Samantha's preference for substance over spectacle. Employees from across the organization attended, sharing stories of the changes they had witnessed and the hope they felt for the future. Rachel, the manager who had delivered the keynote speech weeks earlier, approached Samantha with a smile. You've done something incredible here, she said. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Samantha smiled in return. That's all I ever wanted. To start something that could grow beyond me. Later that night, Samantha returned to her office. The city was quiet, the snow still falling softly outside. She sat at her desk, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The challenges had been immense, and the resistance fierce, but the progress was undeniable. She opened her laptop and began drafting a letter to the company's employees. In it, she acknowledged the difficulties they had faced together, the courage it had taken to confront uncomfortable truths, and the work that still lay ahead. But she also expressed her gratitude for their resilience, their honesty, and their willingness to embrace change. As she finished the letter, Samantha felt a quiet sense of peace. The fight against prejudice and injustice was far from over, but she knew they had taken a meaningful step forward. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful, not just for the company, but for the people who made it what it was. And as she closed her laptop and turned off the lights, Samantha allowed herself a small smile. The road ahead would be long, But she was ready for whatever came next. Together, they were building something better. And that, she knew, was worth everything.